The water was a shock of ice and fury. 1 second, Vivian Jackson was kneeling on a muddy riverbank in the Wyoming Territory, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The next, the ground gave way beneath her, and she was tumbling headfirst into the raging current of the Blackwater River. The cold stole her breath, a thief in the night. Her heavy skirts, a lady's burden, became an anchor, dragging her down into the dark, churning depths. She fought, clawing her way to the surface, her lungs burning. "Help!" The word was a choked gasp, swallowed instantly by the river's roar. She was pulled under again, the world a terrifying blur of brown water and green weeds. Vivian had never learned to swim. She was 22 years old, fleeing a life she no longer recognized, and she was going to die alone in the wilderness. Her arms thrashed, her mind screamed, but it was useless. The current was a monster, and it was winning. Then, through the chaos, a voice cut through the roar. "Hold on!" A shape splashed into the water ahead of her, a man diving headfirst into the same frigid hell that was claiming her. He was swimming with powerful, determined strokes, not fighting the river but using its own strength to angle towards her. Just as her vision started to fade to black, a strong arm wrapped around her chest, pulling her head above the water. She coughed, sputtered, and clung to him, a desperate survivor clinging to a living raft. "I've got you," the stranger grunted, his voice strained with effort. "Stay with me." He fought the river for both of them, his muscles straining against the weight of her waterlogged clothes and the relentless pull of the current. It felt like an eternity, a desperate battle in the fading light. Finally, his feet found purchase on the riverbed. He stood, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and waded through the shallows to the safety of the bank. He laid her gently on a patch of grass, and she collapsed, shivering violently, her lips blue, her body trembling with a cold that went bone deep. The man knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern. He brushed the wet, tangled strands of her blonde hair from her face. "Miss, can you hear me?" His voice was low and steady. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw a man of about 30, with dark hair, kind eyes, and a rugged handsomeness forged by the sun and the saddle. She tried to speak, to thank him, but only managed to cough up more river water. "Don't talk," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "We need to get you warm. Now." He worked with a speed and efficiency that was mesmerizing. He gathered dry wood, struck a flint and steel, and in moments, a small, hopeful fire crackled to life beside them, casting a warm, dancing glow on her pale face. "Thank you," she managed to chatter through her trembling teeth. "My name's Quentin Daniels," he said, his hands moving constantly, wringing out his bandana to wipe the mud from her face. "You're going to freeze in those wet clothes?" Vivian's eyes widened in alarm at the implication, but he quickly added, "I've got a spare shirt at my camp, but I can't leave you. Not yet." He did something then that should have scandalized her. He moved behind her, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around her to shield her from the evening chill. "I'm sorry for the impropriety, miss," he explained, his voice a low rumble against her back. "But body heat is the quickest way to stop the shaking. I give you my word as a gentleman. I mean no disrespect." She should have protested. She should have been outraged. But the solid warmth of his body seeping into hers was too vital, too necessary to reject. She leaned against him, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her spine. The violent tremors that racked her body began to subside. "Vivian Jackson," she whispered. "I was trying to get to Silver Creek." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice held a note of surprise. "Well, what do you know?" he said. "That's where I'm headed to." What a coincidence. Or so she thought. She had no idea that this man, this stranger who had just pulled her from a watery grave, was no coincidence at all. He was the first piece of a puzzle she didn't even know she was a part of, a puzzle that would involve secrets, lies, and a danger far greater than any rushing river. Her journey had just begun, and the man holding her was not who he seemed. Not at all. He carried her to his camp as if she were a child, his strength a silent promise of safety. His campsite was small and orderly, a bedroll laid out near the dying embers of his cooking fire, a gray horse grazing peacefully nearby. He set her down on a log, stoked the fire back to life, and pulled a clean flannel shirt and a blanket from his saddlebag. "It's not fancy, but it's dry," he said, handing them to her. "I'll turn my back." Vivian clutched the items, her mind reeling, alone in the wilderness with a strange man, about to wear his clothes. Yet, she trusted him. She didn't know why, she just did. Changing was an ordeal. Her fingers were numb, clumsy, and the tiny buttons of her blouse refused to cooperate. A small sound of frustration escaped her lips. "Are you all right?" Quentin asked, his back still resolutely turned. I can't manage the buttons," she admitted, her face burning with humiliation. There was a pause. "Would you like some help?" Practicality won out over propriety. "Yes, please," she whispered. He turned, his expression unreadable. With large, calloused hands that were surprisingly gentle, he undid the buttons, his eyes fixed firmly on the task, his knuckles occasionally brushing her cold skin. The moment he was done, he turned away again. She quickly changed, slipping into his large flannel shirt that fell to her knees and wrapping the blanket around her waist like a skirt. "I'm decent," she said. He turned back, a look of relief on his face. He poured her a cup of hot, black coffee. The bitter liquid warmed her from the inside out. "My aunt lives in Silver Creek," she explained, feeling the need to fill the silence. "My father passed away and I had to leave Chicago." She told him a sanitized version of the truth about her father's business partner, Mr. Hargrove, and his unwelcome advances. She left out the part about the veiled threats, the cold look in his eyes when she refused his proposal of marriage, the chilling sense that he wasn't just entitled, but dangerous. Quentin listened without interruption, his jaw tight. "So you ran," he stated, more of an observation than a question. "I had to," she confirmed. "My Aunt Elena owns the millinery shop, the Silver Thimble." A flicker of something crossed Quentin's face at the mention of her aunt's name, so quick she almost missed it. But it was there, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, a recognition. He said nothing, simply poking the fire with a stick. "We'll get you there safely," he promised, his voice low and certain. "It's not safe for a woman to travel alone." He insisted she take his bedroll, saying he would keep watch. As she drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his blanket, warmed by his fire, she watched him sit with his back against a tree, his revolver resting across his lap. He was a protector, a guardian angel sent to her in her moment of need. She fell asleep believing she had been saved by a chance encounter, a stroke of good fortune. She was wrong. Quentin Daniels wasn't just a cowboy heading in the same direction. He was watching her, and it had started long before she ever fell into that river. They set out the next morning after retrieving her horse, Penny. The journey to Silver Creek would take 2 days. They rode side by side, and the wilderness that had seemed so menacing the day before now felt like a grand adventure. Quentin was a natural storyteller, sharing tales of cattle drives and frontier towns, his deep voice a comforting presence. Vivian found herself opening up to him, telling him about her life in Chicago, the life of books and gardens and societal expectations she had fled. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. That night they made camp under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "What about you, Quentin?" she asked, their faces illuminated by the campfire's glow. "Do you have any family?" A shadow passed over his face. "My folks are gone," he said quietly. "Lost our ranch in Texas some years back." "How?" she pressed gently. He stared into the flames, his expression hardening. "A businessman from back east, a real snake, came in with a lot of money and lawyers, squeezed my pa out, broke his spirit. He died a year later. My ma wasn't long after." There was a raw pain in his voice that made her heart ache for him. "I'm so sorry," she said. He just shrugged, but the muscle in his jaw was ticking. "It was a long time ago. Now I just drift. Work a season here, a season there. It's a living." His story was vague, but the bitterness was real. It painted him as a man wronged, a man without roots. It made him tragic, and it made her feel even closer to him. It was a perfect story, and it was a perfect lie. Not a complete lie, but a lie of omission. He had left out the most important detail. He had left out the name of the man who had destroyed his family. He didn't tell her that the same snake who had ruined his life in Texas was the very same man she was running from. Mr. Hargrove. Quentin knew exactly who she was and who she was fleeing. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been tracking her for days. The aunt's letter, the one Vivian had in her saddlebag, was not the only letter Elena Jackson had written. There was another sent weeks earlier, not to her niece, but to an old friend of the family, a man who owed her a debt, a man she knew could be trusted. She had written to Quentin Daniels, telling him her niece was in danger, that a powerful man would stop at nothing to possess her and her inheritance. She had asked him to find Vivian, to watch over her, to protect her on the dangerous journey to Silver Creek. He wasn't her savior by chance. He was her hired bodyguard. And every kind word, every shared story, every moment of growing intimacy between them was built on that one, glaring secret. He was being paid to keep her safe, and he was using the very man who had destroyed his own life as a way to get close to her. The stage was set for a terrible revelation, and Vivian was riding right into the middle of it, falling for a man whose entire presence in her life was a carefully constructed deception. A storm hit on their second day, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the trail to mud and soaked them to the bone. "There's an old line shack up ahead," Quentin shouted over the rain. "We can take shelter there." The cabin was small and dusty, but it was dry. As Quentin built another fire, the situation felt eerily familiar. Once again, they were stripping off wet clothes, sharing a small, intimate space, isolated from the world. But this time was different. The easy camaraderie had blossomed into something deeper, something unspoken that crackled in the air between them, hotter than the fire in the hearth. Wrapped in a rough blanket while her dress dried, Vivian watched him. He moved with a quiet confidence that she found herself admiring more and more. "You ever think about settling down?" she asked, the question surprising even herself. "Instead of drifting?" He looked up from the coffee he was brewing, his brown eyes searching her face. "I used to," he admitted. "Had a place picked out, a girl I was gonna marry." "What happened?" she asked softly. "She wanted a different life," he said with a sad smile. "One with more comforts than a cowboy could provide." His gaze lingered on her, and in that moment, Vivian felt a powerful connection, a sense of shared loneliness and longing. It felt as if they were two halves of the same whole, two souls who had been drifting until they found each other. The rain hammered on the roof, trapping them in their own little world. He told her more stories, and she laughed more than she had in months. When it was time to sleep, he again insisted she take the single cot. He laid his bedroll on the floor by the fire, close enough that she could see the flicker of the flames reflected in his eyes as he watched her. "Good night, Vivian," he said. his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Good night, Quentin," she whispered back. Sleep did not come easily. She lay there listening to the rain and the crackle of the fire, her heart pounding in her chest. She was falling for him, hard. She was falling for the kind, honorable, tragic cowboy who had saved her life. She was falling for a man who wasn't real. The next day, they rode into Silver Creek. It was a bustling frontier town, larger than she'd imagined, carved out of the wilderness by silver and sweat. Quentin pointed to a neat little storefront. "The Silver Thimble," he said. "Her aunt's shop. Her new life." A woman with kind eyes and hair the color of spun gold rushed out of the shop. "Vivian! Aunt Elena!" They embraced, a tearful reunion on the dusty main street. Elena's eyes then moved to Quentin, a look of profound gratitude on her face. "Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I can ever thank you." "Just did what anyone would do, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. It was the perfect picture of a humble hero. Inside her aunt's cozy apartment above the shop, Vivian recounted her ordeal. As she spoke, she watched her aunt and Quentin. There was something in their interaction, a shared glance, a subtle nod, that felt off. It was a current of understanding that ran beneath their polite conversation, a familiarity that shouldn't have been there. She dismissed it as her imagination. Elena insisted Quentin stay for a hot meal. As they ate, Elena told him about the Double R Ranch, just north of town, which was hiring experienced hands. "That's what I heard," Quentin said. "Thought I'd ride out there this afternoon." Vivian's heart sank. He was leaving so soon. After the meal, he stood to go. He turned to Vivian, his formal demeanor returning. "Miss Jackson, Vivian, I'm glad I could see you safely here." "I can never repay you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then said, "Perhaps I might call on you sometime when I'm in town." "I would like that very much," she breathed. He nodded, a small smile touching his lips, and then he was gone. Vivian watched him from the window, her heart a confusing mix of hope and sadness. "He's a fine man, Vivian," Elena said, coming to stand beside her. "A very fine man." Elena's voice was filled with a sincerity that went beyond simple gratitude. It was the sound of someone whose carefully laid plans had worked out perfectly. That night, as Vivian was unpacking the few belongings she'd brought, she found it. Tucked into a secret pocket of her saddlebag, a place she rarely used, was a second letter from her aunt. This one was sealed. Her name was on the front in Elena's familiar script, along with a note. "Read this only when you are safe in Silver Creek." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter inside was not the cheerful, welcoming note she had received in Chicago. This one was dark, urgent. "My dearest Vivian," it began. "If you are reading this, then thank God my plan has worked. You are not safe. Mr. Hargrove is not merely a persistent suitor. He is a dangerous and ruthless man. I have heard stories from business contacts, whispers of what he is capable of. I knew you would not be safe traveling alone. So I took a precaution. I hired a man to find you on the trail, to watch over you and protect you without your knowledge. I needed someone trustworthy, someone with a reason to see a man like Hargrove fail. His name is Quentin Daniels. His family was destroyed by Hargrove years ago. I pray you never need his protection. But if you are reading this, it means you have. Forgive my deception, but it was born of love and fear." The letter slipped from her fingers. The room spun. Every moment of the past 3 days flashed through her mind, replaying in a sickening new light. The chance meeting, the shared destination, his story of a family ruined by a nameless businessman. The look that passed between him and her aunt. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't fate. It was a transaction, a lie. The man who had saved her life, the man she was falling in love with, had been playing a part the entire time. He was a hired guard with a personal vendetta, and she was just a job, a pawn in his game of revenge against the man who had wronged them both. The feeling of safety she had cherished vanished, replaced by a cold, bitter wave of betrayal. The next few weeks were a blur of polite smiles and a hollow ache in her chest. Vivian threw herself into the work at the hat shop, her fingers flying, her mind racing. She was a good actress. She chatted with customers. She shared meals with her aunt. She spoke of her harrowing journey and her heroic rescue. But she never mentioned the second letter. She kept the knowledge of the betrayal locked away, a cold, hard stone in her heart. She told herself it was better this way. What would confronting them accomplish? Her aunt had acted out of love, and Quentin was just doing a job that was now finished. But every other Saturday, when the hands from the Double R came to town, a part of her would watch the street, a foolish, hopeful part she couldn't quite kill. Then, one Saturday afternoon, the bell on the shop door jingled, and there he was. He looked clean and handsome, his hat in his hands, a nervous energy about him. "Miss Jackson," he said, his voice hesitant. Elena, ever the matchmaker, immediately insisted Vivian was due for a break and practically pushed them out the door toward the town cafe. They sat in a corner booth, the air thick with unspoken words. He told her about his new job as foreman at the Double R. She told him about the shop. The small talk was excruciating. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Why did you lie to me, Quentin?" she asked, her voice low and steady, though her hands were trembling in her lap. Confusion flickered across his face. "Lie? About what?" "About us," she said, her voice gaining strength. "About the river. It wasn't chance, was it? You were there for me. You were hired." The color drained from his face. He looked down at his hands on the table, then back up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, bottomless regret. "Vivian, my aunt told me everything," she said, pulling the crumpled letter from her pocket and laying it on the table between them. "She told me about Hargrove, about your family." He flinched at the name. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice hoarse, "when the time was right." "When would that have been?" she shot back, the hurt and anger finally bubbling to the surface. "After I'd fallen completely in love with the brave, mysterious cowboy who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Was that part of the job description?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "That was never. Vivian meeting you, that wasn't part of the plan. What I feel for you, that has nothing to do with Hargrove or your aunt's money." "Doesn't it?" she whispered, her heart breaking. "Everything between us started with a lie." "It started with me watching you from a ridge, making sure you were safe," he countered, leaning forward, his voice intense. "It started with me seeing you fight for your life in that river and knowing I would die before I let anything happen to you. The lie was not telling you the truth sooner, but my feelings for you, they're the truest thing in my life." His sincerity was a tangible thing. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But the foundation of trust had been shattered. Before she could respond, the doors to the cafe flew open. A man stood there, large and menacing, with a jagged scar running down his cheek. Behind him were two other men, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They weren't cowboys. They were predators. The scarred man's eyes scanned the room, and then they locked on Vivian. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice like gravel. "Look what we found. Mr. Hargrove sends his regards. He's very eager for you to come back to Chicago, Miss Jackson. Says you have some unfinished business." The cafe went silent. Quentin was on his feet in an instant, moving to stand between Vivian and the men. His body was tense, his hand hovering over his own revolver. "She's not going anywhere," Quentin said, his voice cold as steel. The scarred man chuckled. I wasn't asking. The town of Silver Creek had never seen anything like it. 3 of Hargrove's hired guns, a notorious crew known as the Black Creek Raiders, had taken over the main street. They had stormed the cafe, but Quentin, with a speed Vivian couldn't have imagined, had overturned their table, giving them just enough cover to slip out the back, while the town sheriff, a brave but aging man named Peters, tried to intervene. Now, the raiders were holding the sheriff hostage in the saloon, demanding that Vivian be handed over. The whole town was on edge, caught in a conflict that had been imported from the drawing rooms of Chicago to their dusty frontier streets. People locked their doors, peering through curtains, their peaceful lives shattered. Vivian, Quentin, and Elena were holed up in the millinery shop, the windows shuttered. The weight of what was happening, the fact that these violent men were here for her, was crushing. This is my fault, Vivian whispered, her face pale. I brought this danger to your home. Nonsense, Elena said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled as she loaded an old shotgun. This is Hargrove's fault, and we will not let that monster win. Quentin was a different man. The quiet, gentle cowboy was gone. In his place was a hardened strategist, his eyes sharp and focused. They think this is a simple snatch and grab, he said, checking his revolver. They've underestimated this town, and they've underestimated me. He revealed the rest of his story then, the parts he had held back. Hargrove hadn't just ruined his family financially. He had sent men, thugs like the ones outside, to intimidate his father. The fight had gotten out of hand. His father had been beaten, left with injuries that eventually led to his death. Quentin had been just a boy, but he had sworn revenge. That's why he had taken Elena's job. It wasn't for the money. It was for a chance, any chance, to strike back at the man who had taken everything from him. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Vivian, he said, his eyes meeting hers. I was ashamed of using your situation for my own vendetta. But when I met you, the revenge didn't matter anymore. Only you mattered. His confession, laid bare in the face of imminent danger, changed everything. The betrayal she had felt was replaced by a wave of understanding. He wasn't a liar. He was a man haunted by his past who had found a new future in her. And now that future was threatened. What do we do? She asked, her voice finding its strength. We fight, he said simply. Quentin, using his knowledge of the town's layout, began to organize a resistance. He slipped out the back, rallying the men from the Double R who were trapped in town, along with other townsfolk who refused to be intimidated. They weren't trained fighters, but they were hard-working people defending their homes, and Quentin was a natural leader. The plan was audacious. They would create a diversion at one end of town, drawing some of the raiders out of the saloon. Then, under the cover of that chaos, Quentin and a small group would storm the saloon from the back to rescue the sheriff. Vivian refused to stay behind. I can't shoot like you, she said, but I can help. Her knowledge of the shop's back passages and the adjoining buildings was crucial. She would lead a second group, including her aunt, to a vantage point where they could provide cover. The city girl who had once fainted at the sight of a mouse was now preparing for a gunfight. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. As darkness fell, the plan was set in motion. A fire, deliberately set in an empty hay wagon, roared to life at the far end of Main Street. Just as Quentin predicted, the scarred man sent one of his thugs to investigate. That was their moment. Quentin and his men moved like shadows through the back alleys, while Vivian led her group through a series of connected storerooms, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve. They climbed a rickety staircase to the second floor of the general store, which overlooked the saloon's side entrance. Through the grimy window, they could see the remaining 2 raiders inside, distracted by the commotion outside. The signal was a hawk's cry, a sound Quentin had taught her on the trail. When she heard it, She knew he was in position. She took a deep breath, looked at her aunt, and nodded. Elena took aim with her shotgun. The next few minutes were a blur of sound and fury. The back door of the saloon burst open. Gunshots exploded in the night. Vivian watched in horror and awe as Quentin moved with a deadly grace, his revolver barking. From their window, Elena's shotgun roared, shattering the saloon window and sending one of the raiders diving for cover. It was chaos. The scarred man was a formidable opponent, trading shots with Quentin in a deadly dance around the overturned card tables. Sheriff Peters, freed in the confusion, joined the fray. Vivian saw her chance. The second raider, pinned down by the covering fire, was trying to reload. He was exposed for just a second. Without thinking, she grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a large porcelain display head used for hats, and hurled it through the already broken window. It struck the man squarely on the head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Down below, the tide had turned. The scarred leader, now alone and outgunned, made a desperate break for the front door, using a table as a shield. He burst onto the street, only to be met by the armed townsfolk who had been waiting for him. He dropped his guns, his hands in the air. It was over. The aftermath was surreal. The townsfolk, buzzing with adrenaline, gathered in the street. Sheriff Peters, bruised but alive, clapped Quentin on the back, declaring him a hero. Vivian rushed down into the street, straight into Quentin's arms. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe." In the middle of the chaotic, victorious crowd, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and the sight of her brave new friends, Vivian looked up at the man who had twice saved her life. "My hero," she said, and this time she knew it was the truth. Not because he was a hired guard or a man seeking revenge, but because he was a good man who had chosen to fight for what was right, for the town, and for her. He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that sealed their future, a future forged in water and fire. News traveled fast in the West. Within a month, a letter arrived from Vivian's lawyer in Chicago. With the capture of his hired guns and their subsequent testimony, combined with the evidence of his other shady dealings, Mr. Hargrove's empire had crumbled. He had been arrested, his reputation destroyed, his power broken. The threat was gone, for good. The town of Silver Creek slowly returned to normal, but it was a new normal. The shared crisis had forged a stronger community, and at the center of it were Vivian and Quentin. Their deception-born courtship had been reforged into something real and unbreakable in the heat of battle. Quentin was offered the sheriff's job, but he turned it down. "I'm a rancher, not a lawman," he told Vivian. But he was no longer a drifter. He had found his home. He formally proposed to her a week later, not with a fancy speech, but with a simple, heartfelt question on the porch of the millinery shop as the sun set. "Vivian Jackson," he said, taking her hand, "I'm not the man you thought I was when we met. I'm flawed and I've made mistakes. But I love you more than anything. Will you marry me? Will you help me build a life right here?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes." Their wedding was a town-wide celebration. It wasn't a grand affair like she would have had in Chicago, but it was more meaningful than any society wedding could ever be. The whole town came, the people who had fought alongside them, who had accepted her as one of their own. Robert Rutherford, the owner of the Double R, gave Quentin a wedding gift, the deed to a small cabin and 100 acres of land on the edge of the ranch, along with a partnership in the business. The drifter finally had roots. Vivian, the city girl who thought she was running toward a small, quiet life, found herself at the heart of a grand adventure, a founding member of a growing community, and the wife of the most honorable man she had ever known. Years passed. The small cabin grew, room by room, as their family did. They had children, a boy with his father's dark hair and a girl with her mother's golden curls. The love between them, born in a rushing river and tested by gunfire, only deepened with the quiet passing of seasons. Vivian still worked in the shop with Elena, her designs becoming famous throughout the territory. But her greatest creation was the home she built with Quentin, a home filled with laughter and love. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and look out at the land that was theirs. "Do you ever think about that day at the river?" she asked him once, leaning her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Every day," he said softly. "It was the day my life began. The woman who fell into the river hadn't just been rescued. She had been reborn. She found not just safety, but strength. Not just a guardian, but a partner. She had fled a life of gilded cages only to find true freedom in the wild heart of the West and in the arms of the man who had been sent to protect her, but had ended up saving her in more ways than he would ever know. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and frontier justice, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales from the wild and unexpected corners of history.